This picture. It's your mother. But she made sure I was dead years ago. Emily's heart pounded so hard she swore the stranger across from her could hear it. Just moments ago, he had been nothing more than another customer, a nameless face in the dimly lit diner. But now his presence carried an eerie weight. His voice laced with something dark, something dangerous. The soft hum of the flickering fluorescent lights above suddenly felt deafening, the air in the small diner turning thick, heavy with unspoken tension. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to breathe as a chill crawled down her spine. Her throat was dry, her mind spinning. What was he talking about? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee. His sharp blue eyes distant, as if staring through time itself. The way his fingers gripped the ceramic mug, the slight tremble in his jaw, whatever memory he had just unearthed wasn't just painful. It was something much worse. It was dangerous. And then he spoke the words that would change Emily's life forever. The soft buzz of the neon sign outside cast a faint glow through the large windows of Dee Dee's diner, a small, grease-stained hole in the wall on the outskirts of Queens, New York. It wasn't the kind of place you found unless you were looking for it. The scent of coffee and sizzling onions clung to the air, mixing with the faint, ever-present aroma of maple syrup and old vinyl seats. Behind the counter, Emily Harper moved with the efficiency of someone who had worked far too many shifts. At 22, she had already learned how to balance plates on her arm without a second thought, how to smile even when exhaustion pressed down on her, how to make regulars feel at home even when she barely felt at home herself. Her tired hazel eyes scanned the room as she wiped her hands on her faded apron. She spotted Joe, a grizzled old man who had been coming in every morning for as long as she could remember. She flashed him a familiar smile, scribbling down his usual order. Scrambled eggs, black coffee, no sugar. Emily had been a college student once, with dreams bigger than this tiny diner. But those dreams had been shoved aside 2 years ago when her mother, Grace Harper, had been diagnosed with a chronic lung condition. The medical bills had piled up faster than she could count, forcing her to trade in textbooks for long hours and minimum wage. Grace, once a lively seamstress, now spent her days tethered to an oxygen tank in their cramped apartment. Emily never complained. She couldn't. Her mother was all she had left. The soft ding of the diner's front door snapped her out of her thoughts. She barely glanced up, expecting another regular, another familiar face. But the moment she saw him, everything felt different. A man stepped inside, tall, well-dressed, his charcoal gray suit tailored so perfectly it looked out of place against the backdrop of cracked booths and faded linoleum floors. Silver streaks threaded through his dark hair, and his sharp blue eyes flickered across the room with an unsettling intensity. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who belonged in a high-rise office, not a run-down diner in Queens. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the booths. Emily frowned. Billionaires didn't eat at Dee Dee's. "Table for one?" she asked, grabbing a menu as he approached the counter. He nodded once, his gaze sharp, assessing. "Yes, thank you." She led him to a booth near the window, the cracked vinyl seats cleaned to the best of their ability. "I'm Emily. What can I get started for you?" "Coffee, black, and the grilled chicken sandwich." His voice was smooth, controlled, but clipped like he wasn't used to being asked questions. "Coming right up." She scribbled it down, then hurried off, but she could still feel his eyes on her, watching. 20 minutes later, she returned with his order, balancing the plate and steaming coffee with the kind of practiced ease that only came from repetition. As she set them down, she noticed something in his hands, a leather wallet flipped open to a faded photograph. She wasn't trying to pry. But then she saw it. Her breath hitched. It was her mother. Not as she was now, frail and weighed down by illness, but as she had been years ago, vibrant, full of life, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders as she laughed at something just beyond the frame. Emily's hands trembled. Her stomach twisted into knots. Why did this man, this complete stranger, have a photo of her mother in his wallet? She forced a tight smile, setting the plate down a little too hard. "Enjoy your meal." The words felt forced, unnatural, but she needed to get away, needed to think before she let the panic show on her face. Back at the counter, her mind raced. Who was he? Friend? A relative? No, her mother had never mentioned anyone like him. And Emily's father. He had walked out when she was a baby, a ghost of a name she had never even known. Could this man? Oh, impossible. She shook her head, gripping the counter as if it would somehow steady the storm of questions swirling in her chest. When it came time to bring the bill, Emily hesitated. But she had to ask. Steeling herself, she approached his table, heart hammering. He was still there, sipping his coffee, his wallet now closed beside him. Sliding the check across the table, she forced the words out before she could stop herself. Can I ask you something? He looked up, one brow lifting slightly. Of course. Emily swallowed. Then in a breath she blurted out. That picture in your wallet. That's my mom. How do you have it? The man froze. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Shock, maybe even guilt. Or fear. His coffee mug hovered midair. His posture stiffened. What did you say? His voice was low, almost a whisper. Emily clenched her fists. That woman in the photo. She's my mom. Grace Harper. His piercing blue eyes locked onto hers, unblinking. You're sure? She straightened. Yes. I'd know her anywhere. Silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating. Then, without a word, he stood abruptly, pulling out a crisp $100 bill and setting it on the table. Far more than his meal cost. Keep the change. His voice was tight, unreadable, as he brushed past her toward the door. Emily spun around. Wait! But the bell above the door jingled. He was already gone. She stood frozen, staring at the crumpled bill in her hand. What just happened? Outside, the man, Daniel Carver, slid into the back seat of a sleek black SUV parked across the street. His hands shook as he pulled out his phone. Mark, I need an address. The waitress at Dee Dee's diner. Emily Harper. Find her. Now. Daniel Carver stared at the glowing screen of his phone, barely breathing. The words burned into his mind. A run-down apartment building 5 blocks away. His fingers tightened around the device as his thoughts spiraled. Grace Harper. After all these years. And a daughter. The realization slammed into him like a freight train, knocking the air from his lungs. He had built an empire. Carver Industries, a titan in the tech world worth billions. He had power, influence, the kind of success people spent lifetimes chasing. But his past. That was a locked door, one he had rarely allowed himself to open. And yet here it was. Open. Suppose. 23 years ago he had walked away. Grace had been just a seamstress with dreams far bigger than her paycheck. And he had been a reckless young man, too blinded by ambition to see what truly mattered. She had begged him to stay. She had loved him. But he had chosen his career, his future, over her. Over them. He never knew she was pregnant. She never told him. Now, as he stared at the address, the weight of everything he had lost crushed him. She had my child, our child. And I never knew. His jaw clenched, guilt clawing at his chest like an animal trying to escape. He turned to the driver. Go. Now. Emily Harper's shift at Dee Dee's diner ended at 8 p.m., the same way it always did, with aching feet and a tired mind. The cold Queen's air nipped at her face as she trudged home, the quiet hum of the streetlights the only sound accompanying her. But her thoughts weren't on the walk. They weren't on the familiar cracks in the sidewalk or the distant honking of a cab. They were on him. The man. The stranger with the piercing blue eyes. The billionaire who had walked into her life and left behind nothing but questions. By the time she reached her building, she still hadn't made sense of any of it. Her fingers trembled slightly as she unlocked the door to their tiny apartment. The moment she stepped inside, the familiar wheeze of her mother's oxygen tank greeted her. "Mom, I'm home," she called, kicking off her sneakers. "In here, sweetie," came the rasped reply from the bedroom. Emily peeked inside, offering a tired smile. Grace lay propped up on pillows, her once bright auburn hair now a dull gray. Her body thinner than it should be. But her eyes still held warmth, even through the exhaustion. "How was your day?" Grace asked, her voice gentle. Emily hesitated, perching on the edge of the bed. For a second she almost told her. Almost said, "Mom, a man came into the diner today. He had a picture of you. He looked at me like he knew me." But she stopped herself. Grace didn't need stress. And whatever that man's story was, Emily wasn't sure she wanted to hear it. "Just the usual chaos," she muttered instead, forcing a smile. A sharp knock at the door cut through the moment. Emily frowned. No one visited this late. She crossed the apartment, her heart thudding harder with every step. Peering through the peephole, she felt her stomach drop. She hesitated, fingers gripping the doorknob. Every instinct screamed to turn around, to pretend she wasn't home. But something in his eyes, something raw, desperate, made her pause. Slowly she cracked the door open. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "How did you find me?" His expression was controlled, but his voice held an urgency she couldn't ignore. "I need to see your mother." Her body tensed. "Why?" "I'll explain." "Just please. Let me in." Everything inside her told her not to. But against her better judgment, she stepped aside. He entered, his presence immediately filling the tiny apartment, making it feel even smaller. "Who is it, Em?" Grace called weakly from the bedroom. Emily swallowed hard, then turned to lead him inside. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she watched her mother's face. The moment Grace saw him, her entire body stiffened. Her oxygen mask slipped from her fingers. "Daniel," she whispered. His breath hitched. His carefully crafted composure cracked, and his eyes glistened with unshed tears. "Grace." His voice was barely more than a breath. Emily's world tilted. "Mom, you know him." Grace's gaze darted between them, her frail hands trembling as she reached for Emily's arm, as if trying to steady herself. Then, with a voice barely above a whisper, she said the words that shattered everything. "Emily, this is your father." The room spun. Emily's grip tightened on the bed frame, her knees threatening to give out. "What?" Daniel turned to her, his face pale. His expression filled with something she couldn't decipher. "You're my daughter," he said, almost like he was saying it aloud for himself. "I didn't know." Grace's voice broke. "When you left, I found out I was pregnant. I tried to tell you, Daniel, but you were gone. You were building your empire. I couldn't reach you." Daniel's entire body sagged, as if the weight of the past was finally too much to bear. He sank into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I didn't know, Grace," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I swear, I didn't know." Emily collapsed onto the floor, staring at him. This man, the stranger who had walked into her life less than an hour ago, was her father? "You left us," she choked out. "For what?" "Money." Daniel flinched. "I was a fool," he admitted, his voice raw. "I thought success was everything. I ran from responsibility, from love. But I kept that picture of your mom because it was the one thing I couldn't let go of. I never stopped regretting it." Silence wrapped around them thick.